media is kind of a strange thing. And really, social media is still an infant. I mean, it's really only been around, in a kind of a mass form where most of us have been on social media for, 12 years maybe, 13 years? It's in the whole scheme of human history, social media is still in its infancy. In my opinion, maybe has already overstayed its welcome. When I published my first book, right? This wasn't the first book that I published, but it's the only picture I could find. But when I published my first book, I put it up on social media and, had a picture of me with it right beside me. Like, look, Aaron published a book. Isn't that great? And it got a whole bunch of likes and it got a whole bunch of comments. And, that's what social media is for, right? You put up, the successes that you have in life so that your friends and family, no matter whether you knew them when you were 3 years old or whether you know them now at your old age or whatever, they can see that you're accomplished, right? Okay, so if I would rewind about 2 or 3 years before I published my first book, I had a great idea for a book. It was about discipleship in the Gospel of Mark. I wrote, I think, 4 or 5 chapters of the book. I created a huge proposal, for publishing companies. I even had Don Bingham illustrate a couple of the chapters, and so there were nice little drawings that Don did in there for me. And I started kind of shopping it around to publishers. And I got ghosted by almost all of them. One publishing company decided that they were going to respond to me, and this is how they responded to me. They said, well, whenever you decide that you're going to write a book about discipleship, you got to know that you're competing with some of the great minds of church history, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And you, sir, are no Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So I got rejected. And you know what I didn't do when I got home? I didn't get on social media and write a big post. I didn't write this. I should have. I should have been, hey, everybody, just wanted you to know that my book proposal got crushed because I'm a nobody who's never accomplished anything. Okay, what kind of Facebook post would that be, right? When I got any number of jobs, I've had lots of different jobs in my life. Every once in a while, you'll post a little blurb on LinkedIn or something like, hey, start a job with such and such. And, you get a few likes and a few comments. There's been a lot of times where I applied for jobs, and I didn't hear of anything from anybody, just completely ghosted. I didn't get on LinkedIn and say, hey, network, I got a job at such and such with these, or I got rejected for a job with such and such titles and such responsibilities. They didn't even call me back. I sent my resume and I spent hours and hours filling out whatever they wanted me to fill out. Got nothing. Nobody does that, right? Nobody puts that on social media. Okay, when I passed a couple of CPA exams, I put this up on my LinkedIn. FAR and reg down, audit and BEC to go. Don knows about this kind of stuff. And I got 5 likes. And I got 148 views. That's great. All right, now, if I had failed one of these exams, would I have gone home and got on my LinkedIn network and said, just want everybody to know, I failed FAR today. Just wanted that out there for all to see. Of course not. You're not going to put that on Facebook, right? I had a terrible interview, I remember, in the past. And I didn't get on LinkedIn and say, hey, I just had a job interview where I completely blew softball questions. And now I'll never work for that place and probably blackballed forever. I didn't do that. I once posted a picture on Facebook of me sleeping on the couch with one of my kids. And there were some people that liked it. There were some people that commented on it, how adorable it was. You know what I didn't post on Facebook? I didn't post, that one time where I was yelling at a child because I told them to wash the dishes 10 times in a row and they never washed the dishes. I didn't put that on Facebook with a big angry face, like, why aren't you washing the dishes? What I'm trying to tell you, the image that we put onto social media is scrubbed up. Right? It's scrubbed up so hard that it shines. We might post a slice of reality, but we definitely don't post all of reality. We don't want to put our struggles on there. We want to create an image that, that we have things all together so that when people look at your snaps or people look at your Instagram or your Facebook or whatever it is that you use, they see a life filled with meals at fancy restaurants, with smiling family members and perfect days. And that may be a slice of your reality, but I guarantee you it is not the whole of your reality, right? We don't post about the whole of our reality. We scrub it up. I had an old friend from college. He teaches at a college out in Arizona now, but he decided one year, I think it was pretty much, that he was just going to post real Facebook posts about what was really going on in his life. And a lot of the things that I just talked about, like not getting a job or getting rejected, he started posting things like this on his Facebook. And so I just thought, I want to find that. So I got onto his Facebook when I was researching for this sermon, and I just started to go back to try to find those posts. And it took me until 2009 is when I found them. So it was 12 years ago. So here we are 12 years later, and I still remember that. It's probably one of the most impactful things I've ever seen on social media, is somebody that was actually not trying to scrub themselves up, but really trying to give an accurate picture of what real life is like for real people. Normally, social media is a place where we put our best foot forward. It's a place where we try to advertise ourselves in the best way that we possibly can, rather than to show what is real. And that's natural, right? It's natural to want to put your best foot forward. It's natural to want to create an image of yourself that is as attractive as possible, as intellectual as possible, a person that has it all together with all strengths and no weaknesses. And I think that's what we see here from these false teachers. That's exactly how they live their life. They were trying to tell other people how great they are. They were advertising themselves all the time. I think if they had social media back in the day of these false teachers, I think LinkedIn would have probably been their favorite social media site. So I kind of went ahead and I did a little bit of a write-up for one of them. I'm a self-starter. I got letters of recommendation from the greatest religious teachers of my time. I've successfully traveled to distant parts of the empire to spread my message. I've been met with people who look up to me and respect my opinions and believe me to be extremely eloquent and possess great style. Who wouldn't like that guy? Who wouldn't want to be a part of that? What a profile, right? Paul, in contrast here, talks about his weaknesses, how many times he's been beaten, how many times he's been stoned, how he has a reoccurring sin issue in his life that just doesn't seem to go away. These are the kind of things that Paul would have put on LinkedIn, and people would have scrolled right on by and said, who's that guy? Why is he putting that kind of stuff on there? And so we see this huge disconnect between the scrubbed up version that we get from the false teachers versus the picture of reality that we get from Paul. Paul even tells a story here at the end of chapter 11 that just seems to be out of the blue. He says that he's being chased down by people that want to hurt him, and so he has to be lowered out of the wall in a fish basket. A fish basket is exactly what it sounds like. You go fishing, you put the dead fish in a basket, you take it home to be clean. That's what happened to Paul. He had to be put into a fish basket in order to get away from the people that were chasing him down. Is that something that you put on your social media site? Do you get on there and say, hey guys, I was lowered down in a fish basket. Aren't I the best thing since sliced bread? Of course you don't. So these false teachers are scrubbing themselves up. They're making themselves look like they are perfect, when in reality, they are in this airbrushed reality that isn't real at all. And so we need to learn something. We need to learn that a spiritual leader is not spiritual just because they tell you that they are. A spiritual leader is spiritual because of what they do, the actions and attitudes of their life. And so here's the central truth today. Spiritual leaders should let their actions and character speak rather than their words. They should let their actions and character speak rather than their words. And so I think there's two things going on here. You can tell me you're great, but instead, why don't you show me that you're great? And second of all, Paul says, I'm not going to boast about the things that are great about me. In fact, I'm going to boast about the things that aren't so great, so that you see the glory of Christ when you look at me, and you don't see my glory. And those are the two things that are going on here, I think, that we need to kind of grab a hold of. So what are some actions that we should let speak for themselves as spiritual leaders? But I don't think that this just applies to spiritual leaders. I think that it applies to all of us. So what are these things about our character that should speak for themselves without words? And I think the first one is humility. The first one is that you and I, we should be humble. Spiritual leaders should be humble. If you think a normal job interview is awkward, you should try interviewing as a pastor. where you are speaking to a board of maybe 15 to 20 just normal everyday people about intimate areas of your doctrine, of your practice, and of your life in general. It's kind of awkward. I remember one church I applied at, one of the pastoral search committee members called up one of my references and asked him, well, can Aaron play softball? Will he be able to carry our softball team? That was literally the only question that they asked him. Now, he didn't know. He didn't know me in that kind of way. He didn't know whether I could play softball or not. And so he says, I don't know if he can play softball. I doubt it. He doesn't look like the softball type. All right? But that didn't stop this guy. I remember I sat in a room, surrounded by these 15 members, pastoral search committee. He's like over here somewhere. And he kind of peeked over and he said, but can you carry the softball team? I was like, what? I was like, is that like an important part of this job description? I don't remember seeing that listed there that, got to play softball really well. I could have taken a page out of other people's books and said, I'm the best softball player that you ever saw. Just ask anyone. Everyone agrees. No one's ever seen such a great player. But, I'm a terrible interviewer because I'll tell you the truth. And I said, you know what? I can play softball. I ain't going to be the star of your team. That's for sure. Right? But, that's what mattered to that guy, apparently, was when his spiritual leaders play softball. I don't think we should airbrush ourselves. I've always been of the opinion I would rather undersell myself and overdeliver rather than oversell myself and underdeliver. But that just works against how our society works at all. A good interviewer is able to tell any kind of recruiter or any kind of hiring manager they come across, I am the perfect person for this. I will help your organization move forward. I'm great at my job. You need to hire me. I'm the perfect fit. Those are the type of people that end up getting the job, the people who are able to self-advertise. But this isn't what God wants from us. He wants us to be humble. This is a proverb that comes from Proverbs 27:2. Let another praise you and not your own mouth. Let a stranger praise you and not your own lips. Man, is that hard to do. And what's Solomon trying to say there? He's basically trying to say, put your head down, do what you're supposed to do, and let your actions speak. Rather than you trying to self-advertise, rather than you trying to airbrush yourself, tell other people how great you are, show it by your actions, show it by your character, not by your words. Once you get your foot in the door, put your head down, do your job well, do it with integrity, and let your actions speak. So here's the situation Paul's facing. He's basically planted this church in Corinth. He was there when there was nothing. He went to the synagogue first, and he led a lot of the Jewish people to the Lord. Then they expanded their reach out into the Gentile area, and they brought in a whole bunch of Gentiles and brought in these new believers. And, the church started to grow both spiritually and numerically. Then Paul had to take off. Then these false teachers come in and they said, you know what? Paul's not the right guy for you. Paul's been telling you things that aren't true. We've got the real gospel. We've got letters of recommendation from the Jerusalem church. We're the ones who know what we're talking about, not Paul. And they were just constantly downgrading him and talking him down in his own church that he planted, to the point where these people were believing these airbrushed false teachers rather than believing Paul. And so Paul has got this awful dilemma here. He's got to defend himself. And in order to defend himself, he's got to talk himself up. And he's also got to show the dangers of these false teachers. This is not something that Paul wanted to do. It isn't something that Paul asked to do. In fact, you can tell by reading these verses, he felt like a fool for doing it. But he has to, because if they take him down, they're going to take down the truth of the gospel with him. And so Paul has to stand up for himself. I think I was kind of always taught from the time that I was little that Paul's kind of an arrogant guy. And a lot of times people point at a book like 2 Corinthians and say, look at, Paul talks himself up here. But this is not what Paul wanted to do. Paul was not this way normally. Paul did not have to defend himself most of the time. He didn't do this. Even the Corinthians see kind of the disconnect and the way he lived his life when he was with them versus how he is responding in these letters. Paul was backed into a corner and forced to have to kind of brag about himself. He's not an arrogant guy, especially when you understand what true humility is. True humility is following in the footsteps of Christ, the sacrificial, footsteps of Christ who consider other people as more important than ourselves. So Paul backed into this corner. He has to defend himself, because in defending himself, he's also defending the truth of the gospel message against the attack of these false teachers. So we call this, in chapter 11 and chapter 12, you'll hear people refer to it as the fool's speech, because that's what Paul refers to himself as here. I got to be a fool for a little bit. I got to brag. I've got to boast in order to save the church. And so he's kind of forced to self-advertise. But here's the interesting thing. He does not play by the same rules as these false teachers. They kept talking about how great they were because of their strengths. They were airbrushing reality. Paul comes in, and the things that he boasts about are his love for people, his dedication to Christ, his suffering for the sake of the church. He says, these are the things I'm going to boast about. I'm going to boast on my weaknesses, because it's in my weaknesses that Christ's strength is really shown. He even boasts in a reoccurring sin issue. We're going to talk about that more in a couple weeks when we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 12. But he's boasting in his weaknesses, because when he is weak, it is then that he is strong. So clearly, Paul's not interested in boasting about himself. I mean, he could have played the exact same game as these guys. He could have played it to the T. He has an impressive resume. I mean, let's think about the life of Paul. How did Paul's spiritual journey start? If you remember, he's walking along the road, towards Damascus, breathing murder against Christians, and Jesus stops him in his tracks. He literally sees the incarnate Christ, who tells him, I want you to be a church planter for me. That's a pretty impressive part of Paul's resume. Here, let me tell you how I came to the faith. Jesus himself appeared to me. Did he appear to you? I don't think so. Then what? Paul, studied underneath Gamaliel, one of the most important rabbis of the day. Does Paul say that here? Does Paul say, well, do you know who I studied under? Did you study under a rabbi that significant? I don't think so. Paul planted churches all throughout the Roman Empire, from Macedonia down to Achaia, over, to where he grew up in the Tarsus area, down to Damascus. He was all over the place, starting new work for the kingdom of God. Does Paul mention any of that? No. Paul could have played the game they played. He had an extremely impressive resume, more impressive than theirs. But that's not the game that Paul wanted to play. He says, if I'm going to boast, I'm going to boast in my weakness, because it's in our weaknesses that Christ's strength is seen all the more. So I think we need to learn from this. This is kind of countercultural, right? I mean, we're supposed to talk ourselves up. But I think we learn here that instead we should aim for humility. We should put our head down. We should do what the Lord wants us to do. We should care about other people more than we care about ourselves. And that's going to characterize good, solid, godly, spiritual leaders. People that are not in it for themselves, but are in it for the glory of Christ. So when we think about spiritual leadership, when we think about our leaders, that's what we should be looking for. We shouldn't be looking for the people with the most eloquent words, the people who talk about how they're great and how they got the best resume in the world. We should be looking for people of character, people of integrity, people who love others, people who are humble. And that leads us to the second one. Not only should we look for spiritual leaders that are humble, but we should also look for spiritual leaders that care for other people. So let's look at verse 19 here, chapter 11. For since you are so wise, you put up with fools gladly. For you put up with it if somebody makes slaves of you, if somebody exploits you, if someone takes advantage of you, if someone behaves arrogantly towards you, even if someone strikes you in the face. All right, jump down to verse 28. Apart from other things, there is the daily pressure of me and my anxious concern for all of the churches. Who is weak, and I am not weak with them? Who is led into sin, and I do not burn with indignation for them? If I must boast, I will boast about the things that show my weakness. So I think what we see here is that spiritual leaders should care for other people. And that is not what these false teachers were about. They did not care about anybody but themselves. That is what Paul was about. Paul suffered immensely because he cared so much for people. There was once a pretty important theologian by the name of Dr. Albert Schweitzer. Here's a picture of him up here behind me. He's got a pretty cool mustache, if I do say so myself, right? He could boast about that. We'll let him. Right? But Dr. Albert Schweitzer is from Germany. He's a brilliant scholar. And he distinguished himself not only in theology, but in other disciplines as well, just kind of a really well-rounded kind of guy. Well, he became famous not only in Germany, but also in America, and he decided that he was going to travel to Chicago to speak. And so he kind of flew into New York, and he got on a train and took it to Chicago. And there was all these people that were lined up at the rail station just waiting for him to get off of the train so that they could greet him and meet this pretty famous theologian. And so the minute that he steps off the train, though, he's not looking at all these dignitaries that are standing in front of him, all these people that have all this power in the area. Instead, he's looking past them. And nobody really knows what he's looking at until he just darts through the crowd, parts the way, and eventually he makes his way to this little tiny old lady who is trying to carry her suitcase but can't seem to wrangle it. And so he grabs a hold of the suitcase for the lady, he picks it up, he asks her, "Where are you headed?" And she says, "Well, I'm just going to get a cab. I got to go to such and such a place." He says, "No, you can take my car." So he takes her over to the car that was meant for him to take him to where he was supposed to go, pays the driver, puts the suitcases of the old lady in the back, helps her in, and says, "Take her wherever she needs to go." After that was all done, then he went back to the important people, apologized to them for the wait, and says, "Now can we get on with this?" To me, that speaks volumes. That's character. That's caring about other people. Yeah, he had an impressive resume, an impressive list of accomplishments, but he also had character and integrity. He cared about other people. Much of life, we care or are concerned about ourselves. But I think what makes a truly great Christian leader is not self-concern, but concern for others. It's not hobnobbing with bigwigs. It's carrying packages for people who can't carry them themselves. It's opening doors for people. It's running errands for people. It's attending to needs. It's looking for ways that we can serve other people. Genuine concern is what makes all the difference. These false teachers, they didn't care about the Corinthians one bit. Look at the record of their actions that Paul puts in here. This is pretty terrible list of actions that Paul has. So if we're looking at the entirety of 2 Corinthians, what we're going to see is that this list is the most scathing one that Paul puts together about how these people were treating others. And so he says, that they have been exploiting them, that they've been enslaving them, that they've been taking advantage of them, that they've been pushing their agenda on them, and they even are slapping them in the face. So let's take each of these in turn. Okay, so what does it mean when Paul says that he's enslaving them? Well, we kind of have this picture of what their doctrine was. Their doctrine was what we would call Judaizers, meaning that they were going into these new churches and they were telling these new Christians, not only do you need to repent of your sins and put your faith in Jesus, but you also need to follow the Mosaic law. If you want to be saved, you need to follow the Mosaic law. And so Paul was preaching this gospel of freedom, preaching the gospel of the new covenant, of forgiveness of sins. And then here comes these false teachers saying, yeah, this Jesus thing is nice, but you've also got to do these things. You've also got to be circumcised. You've also got to follow the Jewish festivals. You've also got to follow the Jewish dietary restrictions. And you've also got to make sure that you observe the Sabbath. And if you don't do these things, then you're not really saved. So what they were doing is they were adding to the message of the gospel, they were adding into it a message of works. And so Paul says these people are trying to enslave you to the old covenant. Don't let them do that. The second thing is that he says that they were exploiting them. Okay, so the word exploit literally means to devour them. They were munching on them. They were eating them for their own good, trying to suck the sustenance out of them. And the only thing I can think about it is probably this was for financial gain. They were taking money from people for their own financial gain. Kind of like televangelists today. They got the little old lady sitting on her couch on Sunday morning and she's watching Robert Tilton or whoever, and they say, send me $10 and you'll be healed or whatever. And they write out these checks, and you got a guy like Robert Tilton who's living in a multi-million-dollar home with big fancy cars and a private plane, and he's taking advantage of people. He's exploiting them. And that's exactly what these false teachers were doing at Corinth. The other word there is that they're taking control of them. So this is like, you set up a trap for an animal and you catch it. That's what the image is here, is that these guys were setting up traps for the people at Corinth, and they were grabbing a hold of them, trapping them into a false gospel. They were pushing themselves forward, lifting themselves up at the expense of pushing down other people. And then the last one we get, and we have no idea necessarily exactly what this means, but we're told that they were slapping them in the face. I don't know if you remember the old VeggieTales where they're doing the the fish slappers. I don't know if you've remember that. But I don't know. I don't know what their church services were like. Like, hey, they come down off of the pulpit and they just start smacking people in the face. I don't think that's what this is talking about. It's probably more figurative. They were literally humiliating people, because that's what a slap is. A slap is humiliating somebody, whether it's a literal slap or a figurative slap. And that's what these people were doing. They were humiliating the church at Corinth. They were abusing them. I mean, you pile up these 5 things. This is not a picture of somebody who cares about the flock, who wants to be an example to the flock. This is a picture of people who are exploiting other people for their own gain, humiliating people for their own gain, so that they can have this great airbrushed image of themselves that they're talking about. And Paul says, why are you putting up with this? Why are you living with this? Why are you letting people exploit you? And this isn't something that just happened in Corinth. This happens all over the place, where spiritual leaders exploit their people. It happens all the time. So if you're brave enough, you can go home and you can type in pastor berates his congregation into YouTube, and there's this video that pops up. And I wanted to play the video, but it's a little too long. It's like 7 or 8 minutes. But it's got this pastor, and it's not funny, but it is funny. It's one of those things you laugh at, but at the same time you're like, why would people put up with this? But it's 8 minutes of this pastor just berating and humiliating members of the congregation. So like he's preaching, just doing his thing, and then he looks at a guy like sitting right there where Don's at, and he just jumps off the stage and runs down to him and tells him to stand up, calls him fat while he's telling him to stand up big boy. And he says, you want me to marry you to her, and you want me to marry you to him. You're one of the sorriest church members I have. I wouldn't give 5 cents for you. And just continues to go on and berate him over who knows what. I mean, he's just humiliating the guy in front of this entire congregation. Then he starts to move away from that guy, and he looks up at the sound booth, and he says to the guy in the sound booth, he says, I hope that you're able to follow me with the video camera. And then he says a couple of nice things about the video guy, saying he puts together the videos of the sermons, and he's appreciative of that. But then he points at him and he says, but he needs an attitude adjustment. And his mama ain't going to stop me from giving him an attitude adjustment because I'm his preacher. And I'm going to tell him what I want to tell him. And he's been building the kingdom in the video room. Kept saying that. He's building the kingdom in the video room. And it's become a youth hangout. And he's going to stop it. Just goes on to berate that guy. Then berates another woman over here. And then it keeps going. And I'm like, why do people put up with that kind of abuse? What's going on in their head that they think this is a picture of a good, godly, spiritual leader? It happens everywhere, all over the world. There are spiritual leaders who are not in it for the congregation. They're not in it for Jesus. They're in it for themselves. That's how cults are built, right? I mean, cults normally are built by some sort of charismatic personality that pushes themselves on other people to the expense of everybody else. I mean, think about a guy like David Koresh, the Branch Davidians. He told his followers, A, they were not allowed to have sex with their wives anymore. Only he could have sex with their wives and their daughters, some of them as young as the age of 12, because he needed to create the 24 elders of the book of Revelation. He was not there to help people. He was there to devour them. He was there to exploit them. He was not leading anybody closer to Jesus. He was using people for his own gain. Godly leaders are not going to be marked by spiritual abuse. Godly leaders, like Paul, are marked by love for God's people and love for the message of God. It should be oozing out of their pores, not taking advantage of others or humiliating them for their own personal gain. So we see that, our spiritual leaders should be humble. Our spiritual leaders should care about people. And third, they should be competent in the things that matter. They should be competent in the things that matter. So look at verse 21 again here. To my disgrace, I must say that we are too weak for that. But whatever anyone else dares to boast about, I am speaking foolishly. I also dare to boast about the same thing. Are they Hebrews? Well, so am I. Are they Israelites? Well, so am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? Well, so am I. And so what Paul's trying to say here is that he has the right pedigree. He has competence in the areas that matter. When I think of pedigree, I think about, the East Coast blue blood guy that, was born into a wealthy family and got into Yale because his daddy went to Yale, and then he graduates and he becomes, one of the higher people in the board of directors of the company because he's got the right pedigree. He's been to the right schools. He's got the right family line. And that's what Paul's saying. These false teachers were claiming to have the right pedigree, even a better pedigree than Paul. We went to the right schools, and we, have letters of recommendation from the right people. Paul doesn't have these things. And so Paul kind of jumps in on this game, and he says, you want to talk pedigree? I have the same pedigree, if not better than you do. They say that they're Hebrews, well, I'm a Hebrew. They say they're Israelites, well, I'm an Israelite. And he goes on and on. They say they're servants of Christ. I am a servant of Christ much more than them. And so if we're going to play that game, Paul says, I'm going to come out on top every time. But Paul is not interested in playing that game because the pedigree is not what matters. What school that you went to is not what matters. Who you studied under is not what matters. What matters is the message. Is the message the correct message? And for these false teachers, it was not. Is, the character, the right character? And for these false teachers, it was not. They were interested only in exploiting people for their own gain. So their qualifications in the end are not what really mattered. What mattered was the content of their teaching, which was wrong. What mattered was their character, which was also off. But I do think we learn a little bit about what this false teaching was like. We do learn that they were Judaizers, that they were people who were trying to tell somebody, if you want to be a good Christian, then you need to follow the law. You need to make sure that you are about the teachings of Moses. They're also good at creating us versus them categories. We're more important Christians because we come from a Jewish background. You Gentiles, you're less important because you come from a Gentile background. Jesus had to fight against this himself. Jesus told some people, he said that you are not better than anybody else simply because of your heritage. Jesus said to them, God is able to raise up children of Abraham out of these stones. Jesus said, if you are indeed Abraham's children, then you're not going to show it by telling me, what your ancestry is. You're going to show it to me by doing the deeds of Abraham, which was faith. So, I think that these guys were rightly recognizing that the true gospel, the gospel that Paul was preaching, was a great equalizer. Because the gospel says that all of us are equally sinners. There's not a group of us that is any better than anybody else or any less sinful than anybody else. All of us has sinned and fall short of the glory of God. The gospel teaches us that all of us are equally deserving of the wrath of God. There's not a group of people over here that God says, you don't deserve wrath. All human beings have fallen short of the glory of God, and all human beings deserve the wrath of God because of it. The gospel also teaches that all people have equal access to salvation through belief in the work of Christ. And so they chafed against this equality because they were somebody. They were more important than other people. And so their message was, no, what is really important in God's eyes is how well you follow the law and what kind of pedigree that you have. And we have a better pedigree. We're better law followers than you. We're more important than you, especially especially than the Gentile Christians. So they were telling these people that they needed to be more Jewish to be more Christian. They needed to be circumcised. They needed to follow the food laws. They needed to practice the Jewish feast. They needed to celebrate the Jewish Sabbath. Paul had to deal with these guys over and over. It's not just in 2 Corinthians. Paul had to deal with them in Galatia. Paul had to deal with them in Ephesus. They're all over the place. In Galatians 2, Paul says that we are Jews by nature and not, these people were saying, we are Jews by nature and not sinners. So think about that statement. And I think that's what these false teachers would have said as well. Not only were they in Galatia, but they were also in Corinth. We are Jews. We are God's people by nature. We are God's people by birth. You're not. We are more important than you are. They were elitist. And so it's no wonder that Paul comes in and says, you're humiliating people, you're taking advantage of them, you're looking down their nose at them because you believe that you have some sort of better pedigree, or you believe that you've earned some sort of merit in the eyes of God that they haven't. In Philippians, Paul deals with these same people. And Paul hits it head on in Philippians 3. He tells them his pedigree. And he goes point by point by point. That he was circumcised on the 8th day. That he was an Israelite. That he was from the tribe of Benjamin. That he was a Hebrew of Hebrews. That he was zealous for the law, even to the point of persecuting the early church. You name it, he had it when it came to pedigree. But what does he say next? He says that all of that pedigree and all of that experience, you know what I consider it? He says, I consider it trash. I consider it refuge compared to the surpassing value of Christ. And my righteousness does not come from my pedigree. My righteousness does not come from my background. My righteousness comes solely from the work of Christ through faith. The rest of this is trash. So anything these false teachers were boasting about, Paul could have played that game. Paul could have boasted about the same things. Oh, you say that you're a Hebrew? Well, so am I. Oh, you say that you studied there? So am I. You say you got this letter of recommendation? I got those too. But Paul's not interested in playing their game and playing by their rules. Paul's going to boast and Paul's going to defend himself, but he's not going to defend himself underneath the same rules that they were, by airbrushing themselves, by exploiting people. He was going to show it by what he did. He was going to show it by his character. He was going to show it by how much he cared about people. And he was going to show it by preaching the right message. In Ephesians, Paul lays it out pretty clearly. He says, for it is by grace that you have been saved through faith. And this, not of yourselves, is a gift of God. It's not by works, so that no one can boast. So what are some actions that we should let speak for themselves? Well, we should be humble. We should care for others. Our spiritual leaders should care for others. Our spiritual leaders should be competent. Okay, and maybe this means some type of pedigree, but ultimately it matters what their lifestyle is like, and it matters that their message coheres to the true gospel. And finally, our willingness to suffer for the things that matter. Our willingness to suffer for the things that matter. So look at verse 22 again. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I'm talking like I'm out of my mind. I'm even more so, with much greater labors, with far more imprisonments, with more severe beatings, facing death many times. 5 times I received from the Jews 40 lashes less 1. 3 times I was beaten with a rod. Once I was stoned. 3 times I suffered shipwreck. A day and a night I spent adrift in the open sea. I've been on journeys many times, in dangers from rivers and robbers, in dangers from my own countrymen, in dangers from Gentiles, in dangers in the city and in the wilderness and at sea, in dangers from false teachers, in hard work and toil through many sleepless nights, and hunger and thirst, many times without food, in the cold, and without clothes. Paul was willing to suffer for the work of God. He's not boasting in his strength. Look at all these great churches that I planted. Look at this great education that I had. Look at this vision that I had. Did you know that I was once taken up into the very throne room of God? It's not how he boasts. Instead, he says, look at what I have suffered for people. Look at how hard I worked and what had to happen to me so that I could make sure that these churches could succeed. That's what should characterize good, godly, spiritual leaders, is a willingness to suffer, a willingness to set aside themselves for the good of other people. In World War I, the American 308th Regiment was absolutely surrounded. And they were taking on mortar and artillery fire, gunfire from all sides. They were running out of supplies, and they were taking heavy casualties. And into this unbearable situation, came the American artillery, and they began to fire on everybody all at once, including the 308th Regiment. So not only are they taking enemy fire now they're taking friendly fire. And it wasn't like they had any kind of necessarily, good communication equipment that they could talk to them and say, hey, quit doing this to us. We're your own people. All they had was homing pigeons. And they only had one of those left. And so they rolled up a little letter saying, hey, we're the 308th Regiment and you're firing on us and you need to stop. They put this little letter up in there. They tied it to the bird's foot and they sent it away, hoping that they would get the message. Well, that bird had to take off through all of that artillery fire, through all that gunfire. And so the pigeon flew up into that melee of bullets, and soon a bullet hit the side of its head and took out its left eye. Then a piece of shrapnel hit the bird and broke its breastbone, but it kept going. Another piece of shrapnel hit it and took off its left leg, but it kept flying. And eventually it made its way to where it was supposed to go. The message was received, and the American forces finally held their fire, and they stopped firing on the 308th Regiment, and they were able to survive. Just think about that bird. It's got this important message, and it's carrying it. And every time that it moves, it's getting blasted. But it continues its journey anyway. And that is a great picture of a godly leader. Somebody that has a greater idea in mind of where to go, that we're supposed to be like Christ, that we're supposed to be spreading the true message of the gospel. And it doesn't matter what kind of bullets come its way, it doesn't matter what's trying to stop it, continues to go. Paul is a great example of that. He knew that God wanted him to be planting churches throughout the Gentile world, throughout the Roman Empire. And he kept doing it, even though he was taking shrapnel. Every few days, he was getting beaten. He was getting thrown in jail. He was getting starved. He was cold. But he did all of this for the sake of the church. He did all of this for the sake of other believers. Look at all this stuff. He's exposed to death again and again. 5 times he received 39 lashes. That's awful. This is something that almost kills you. Literally, they take whips out and they whip you 39 times. He was beaten with rods. He was stoned, where people literally picked up huge rocks and threw them at him. 3 times he was shipwrecked. And that doesn't even include the one that we read about in the book of Acts. That hadn't even happened yet. A whole day he floated in the open sea, waiting for somebody to rescue him. He was also in constant danger from having to ford rivers that were dangerous or dodge bandits. He was in danger from his own people. He was in danger from Gentiles. He was in danger when he was in the city. He was in danger when he was out in the country. He was in danger when he was on the boat. He was in danger because his character was being assassinated by false teachers. He labored and he toiled and he went without sleep. He knew hunger and thirst. He knew what it was like to be bone-chillingly cold, and he was doing it for Christ. He's like, that's what I'm going to boast in. I'm not going to boast in my pedigree. I'm not going to boast in who my rabbi was. I'm not going to boast in what my genetics are and where I came from. I'm going to boast in my weaknesses. I'm going to boast in my sufferings, because it is in our weakness that Christ is strong. How different is that from these false teachers who only cared to advertise themselves? They only cared to airbrush themselves. They talked about their letters of recommendation, how smart they were, how eloquent they were. But could they talk about how much they loved God? Could they talk about how they were faithful to God's message? Could they talk about how much suffering that they willingly endured for God's people? And the answer to that is that they couldn't, because they were not the kind of godly spiritual leaders that God was after. They were false teachers who only cared about lifting themselves up at the expense of others. What this tells me is that true godly spiritual leaders are not always going to be successful by the standards of the world. They certainly won't be marked by an authoritarian dictatorial leadership style. They're going to be characterized by humility and servanthood, by the willingness to suffer for the gospel, to set aside their own desires in order to lift up God's people. That's the kind of leader that God is looking for. That's the kind of leader that Paul was. And so Paul's going to boast, but he's not going to boast like these false teachers. He's not going to boast in his skills and his credentials. He's going to boast in his honesty. He's going to boast in his character. He's going to boast in his love for God's people, his fidelity to the gospel message, and his willingness to endure any difficulty that might come his way for the sake of the gospel. Let's pray.